Good evening. So it is time for installment 3 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Just to refresh your memory, we are at the point where Lucy has gone through the wardrobe, met Mr. Tumnus, and he has explained his plan to kidnap her as she is the daughter of Eve and take her to the White Witch. Um, excuse me. And he has let her return back to the real world. Um, and we're going to go back and read chapter 3, Edmund and the Wardrobe. Just okay. So chapter 3, Edmund and the Wardrobe. Lucy ran out of the empty room into the passage and found the other three there. It's all right, she repeated. I've come back. What on earth are you talking about, Lucy asked Susan. Why, said Lucy in amazement, haven't you all been wondering where I was? So you've been hiding, have you? Said Peter. Poor old Lou, hiding and nobody noticed. You'll have to hide longer than that if you want people to start looking for you. But I've been away for hours and hours, said Lucy. The others all stared at one another. Batty, said Edmund, tapping his head. Quite batty. What do you mean, Lou? Asked Peter. That's what I said, answered Lucy. It was just after breakfast when I went into the wardrobe, and I've been away for hours and hours, and had tea, and all sorts of things have happened. Don't be silly, Lucy, said Susan. We've only just come out of that room a moment ago, and you were there just then. She's not being silly at all, said Peter. She's just making up a story for fun, aren't you, Lou? And why shouldn't she? No, Peter, I'm not, she said. It's a magic wardrobe. There's a wood inside of it, and it's snowing, and there's a faun and a witch, and it's called Narnia. Come and see. The others did not know what to think, but Lucy was so excited that they all went back with her into the room. She rushed off ahead of them, flung open the door to the wardrobe, and cried, Now, go in and see for yourselves. Why, you goose, said Susan, putting her head just inside and pulling apart the fur coats. It's just an ordinary wardrobe. Look, there's the back of it. Then everyone looked in and pulled the coats apart, and they all saw, Lucy herself saw, a perfectly ordinary wardrobe. There was no wood and no snow, only the back of the wardrobe with hooks on it. Peter went in and rapped his knuckles on it to make sure that it was solid. A jolly good hoax, Lou, he said, and then came out again. You have us really taken in, I must admit. We half believed you. But it wasn't a hoax at all, said Lucy. It really and truly, it was different a moment ago. Honestly, it was. I promise. Come, Lou, said Peter, that's going a bit far. You've had your joke. Hadn't you better drop it now? Lucy grew very red in the face and tried to say something, though she hardly knew what it was she was trying to say, and burst into tears. For the next few days she was very miserable. She could have made it up with the others quite easily at any moment if she could have brought herself to say that the whole thing was only a story made up for fun. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she was really in the right, and she could not bring herself to say this. The others who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The two elder ones did this without meaning to do it, but Edmund could be spiteful, and on this occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy, and kept on asking her if she'd found any other new countries in the cupboards all over the house. What made it worse was that these days ought to have been delightful. The weather was fine, and they were out of doors from morning to night, bathing, fishing, climbing trees, and lying in the heather. But Lucy could not properly enjoy any of it, and so things went on until the next wet day. That day, when it came to the afternoon and there was still no sign of a break in the weather, they decided to play hide and seek. Susan was it. And as soon as the others scattered to hide, Lucy went to the room where the wardrobe was. She did not mean to hide in the wardrobe, because she knew that it would only set the others talking in about the whole wretched business. But she did not want to. But she did want to have one more look inside of it, for by this time she was beginning to wonder to herself whether Narnia and the Faun had not been a dream. The house was so large and complicated and full of hiding places that she thought she would have time to have one look into the wardrobe and then hide somewhere else. But as soon as she reached it, she heard steps in the passage outside, and then there was nothing for it but to jump into the wardrobe and hold the door closed behind her. She did not shut it properly because she knew that it is very silly to shut oneself into a wardrobe, even if it is not a magic one. Now the steps she had heard were those of Edmund, and he soon came into the room just in time to see Lucy vanishing into the wardrobe. He at once decided to get into it himself, not because he thought it a particularly good place to hide, but because he wanted to go on teasing her about the imaginary country. He opened the door. There were the coats hanging up as usual, and the smell of mothballs, and the darkness and silence, and no sign of Lucy. "She thinks I'm Susan come to catch her," said Edmund to himself, "and so she's keeping very quiet in the back." He jumped in and shut the door, forgetting what a very foolish thing it is to do. Then he began feeling sorry about Lucy in the dark. He had expected to find her in a few seconds, and he was very surprised when he did not. He decided to open the door again and let in some light, but he could not find the door either. He didn't like this at all, and began groping wildly in every direction. He even shouted out, "Lucy! Lou! Where are you? I know you're here!" There was no answer, and Edmund noticed that his own voice had a curious sound. Not the sound you expect in a cupboard, but a kind of open air sound. He also noticed that he was unexpectedly cold, and then he saw a light. And this is Edmund going into the closet after Lucy, and this is Edmund coming out in Narnia. "Thank goodness," said Edmund. "The door must have swung open of its own accord." He forgot all about Lucy and went towards the light, which he thought was the open door of the wardrobe. But instead of finding himself stepping out into the spare room, he found himself stepping out from the shadow of some thick dark fir trees into an open place in the middle of a wood. There was crisp, dry snow under his feet, and more snow lying on the branches of the trees. Overhead there was a pale blue sky, the sort of sky one sees on a fine winter day in the morning. Straight ahead of him he sat between two tree trunks in the sun, just rising, very red and clear. Everything was perfectly still, as if he were the only living creature in that country. There was not even a robin or a squirrel among these trees, and the wood stretched as far as he could see in every direction. He shivered. He now remembered that he had been looking for Lucy, and also how unpleasant he had been to her about the imaginary country, which now turned out not to have been imaginary at all. He thought that she must be somewhere quite close, and so he shouted, "Lucy! Lucy! I'm here too! Edmund!" There was no answer. "She's angry about all the things I've been saying lately," thought Edmund. And although he did not like to admit that he had been wrong, he also did not much like being alone in this strange, cold, quiet place, so he shouted again. "I say, Lou! I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I see now you were right all along. Do come out. Make it packs." Still there was no answer. "Just like a girl," said Edmund to himself, "sulking somewhere and won't accept an apology." He looked round him again and decided that he did not much like this place, and had almost made up his mind to go home when he heard, very far off in the wood, the sound of bells. He listened, and the sound came nearer and nearer, and at last there swept into light a sledge drawn by two reindeer. The reindeer were about the size of Shetland ponies, and their hair was so white that even the snow hardly looked white when compared with them. Their branching horns were gilded and shone like something on fire when the sunrise caught them. Their harness was of scarlet leather and covered with bells. On the sledge, driving the reindeer, sat a fat dwarf, who could have been about 3 feet high if he had been standing. He was dressed in a polar bear's fur, and on his head he wore a red hood with a long gold tassel hanging down from its point. His huge beard covered his knees and served him instead of a rug. But behind him, on a much higher seat in the middle of the sledge, sat a very different person, a great lady, taller than any woman that Edmund had ever seen. She was also covered in white fur up to her throat, and held a long, straight, golden wand in her right hand, and wore a golden crown on her head. Her face was white, not merely pale, but white like snow, or paper, or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. It was a beautiful face in other respects, but proud and cold and stern. The sledge was a fine sight, as it came sweeping towards Edmund with the bells jingling, and the dwarf cracking his whip, and the snow flying up on each side of it. "Stop!" said the lady, and the dwarf pulled down on the reindeer so sharp that they almost sat down. Then they recovered themselves and stood champing their bits and blowing. In the frosty air, the breath coming out of their nostrils looked like smoke. "And what, pray, are you?" said the lady, looking hard at Edmund. I'm My name is Edmund," said Edmund rather awkwardly. He did not like the way she looked at him. The lady frowned. "Is that how you address a queen?" she asked, looking sterner than ever. "I beg your pardon, your majesty, I didn't know," said Edmund. "Not know the Queen of Narnia!" she cried. "Ha! You shall know us better hereafter. But I repeat, what are you?" "Please, your majesty," said Edmund, "I don't know what you mean. I'm at school. At least I was. It's the holidays now." And this is a picture of the Queen riding up with the little dwarf to meet Edmund in the wood. Unfortunately, this is where our story ends. We will pick up next time with chapter 4, entitled Turkish Delight, which is perhaps one of my favorite chapters in this book. Anyways, I will see y'all next time. Until then, enjoy.